Hey everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I read in April. I have a lot of books to get through. I managed to read 15 books this month, although there were a couple of picture books in there, so they were quite quick reads, but I do actually have a lot of novels to talk about this month, which I'm really happy about. If you are someone that follows my What the Hell Happened to My Haul series, I also managed to read 5 out of the 6 books that I wanted to read from that series. But yeah, let's just get into the books. I'm going to start by talking about the novels, and I'm going to kick things off with The Leavers by Lisa Coe. Now, I'm not going to talk about this one too much because I did do a full review of this book, which I will leave linked down below. But this book follows 2 main characters, the first of which is Deming. He is an 11-year-old boy when this book opens, and the second main character is his mother, Polly. Now, one day, Polly goes to work at the salon, the nail salon I think it is, that she works at, but she doesn't come back, and Deming has no idea what has really happened to Polly. Now, Polly was an undocumented immigrant, and we learn more about her and what happened to her about halfway through the book. The first half, it is very much Deming's perspective, so we have his childhood perspective, but we also see him as about a 20 or 21-year-old. After the assumed abandonment from his mother Polly, he is adopted by a very well-off, middle-class white couple who are professors. And obviously there are a lot of complications in a white couple trying to raise a Chinese baby. The level of success to which they engage with his Chinese heritage fluctuates throughout the novel. And while I think the mother in particular has the best intentions, they often fall short of the mark. Most notably because they rename Deming Daniel. When Deming is contacted by his childhood friend Michael and begins to explore what happened to his mother in more depth, he feels conflicted about whether or not he should try and reach out to his mother and try and make contact again. I think this is a really important book, particularly in the political climate at the moment. I think it is really important to read stories like Deming's and Polly's. However, I don't think it was an absolutely brilliant novel, and I do talk about my reasoning for that more in my full review. I think there were elements of each main character's story that I felt wasn't explored enough, and there were a lot of really interesting elements to their histories that were kind of almost glossed over. Like, one of the most interesting things I found in this book was Deming's gambling problem, but we don't hear a huge amount about that and how things got as bad as they did for him. And I thought a lot of the story was told quite passively. In saying that, I think it is a really fantastic exploration of dual identity, and I'm really excited to see what Lisa Coe does next. Next up is a very different book, and that is You're the One That I Want by Giovanna Fletcher. This is a piece of contemporary women's fiction, and I thought it was fine. I thought it was a really enjoyable read. So this book tells the story of 3 childhood best friends. We have Maddie, Robert, and Ben. The book opens with Maddie walking down the aisle on her wedding day. She is marrying Robert, but she tells us she could have just as easily married Ben. The novel then goes back to when I think they're 4 years old, and it follows them through primary school, through secondary school, into university, after university. I thought the story was paced really well, and I think the author devoted enough time to each section. In a relatively short novel, we are exploring 3 different characters over more than a decade of time span. I thought the characters were crafted really well. I found them very believable. I found them to be a lot more nuanced than I expected. Each character is likable, but each character is very flawed. Because it is a piece of contemporary women's fiction, you might assume that Maddie is the main character in this, but I actually think Ben is the most interesting and the most prominent character in this book. And yeah, I don't really have a whole lot more to say about this one. It's not exactly my cup of tea, but I thought it was enjoyable nonetheless. I thought it was a good palate cleanser between reading a couple of more heavy books that deal with more serious topics, and I was really impressed with the sections of this book where they were teenagers. I would love if Giovanna Fletcher wrote a YA book, because I think it would be done really well. So yeah, not one that's left me thinking, but it was an enjoyable read nonetheless. Now, I just mentioned that book being between quite serious reads, And this next one is definitely one that deals with a very heavy topic. This is Alissa Nutting's novel Tampa. This book follows a high school teacher named Celeste Price. She seems to have it all. She has a very well-off husband. She's got the job that she wants. She's got this amazing car. She's beautiful. But we find out that the only reason that she has become a teacher is because she is sexually attracted to 14-year-old boys. I am going to be talking about rape in the next couple minutes, so if you want to skip past this book because you're not in the right headspace to listen to me talk about that, then I would totally understand. So yeah, our protagonist Celeste begins her first day at her new school, and she is immediately extremely predatory. She is immediately on the lookout for the perfect boy to take advantage of and to rape. Obviously, it's an extremely uncomfortable read, especially since we are reading from Celeste's perspective, so we are very much in her head. I had a couple of horrible moments when I was reading this book when she almost gets caught, and I found myself as a reader thinking, oh no, she can't get caught. But obviously you want her to get caught because she's doing a horrible thing, but you get so caught up in her headspace that it elicits a really uncomfortable reaction like that. The rape scenes in this are really explicit. You sometimes read about stories like this, you know, teachers taking advantage of their students, and when it's a male teacher and a female student, we immediately know that it's wrong. But I think so many people, when it's a beautiful female teacher and a young male student, there is this reaction like, oh, good for him, I would have loved if my teacher was like that, which is awful. And you see a number of people think that way in this book, and you see how at the time the boys that she takes advantage of seem entirely consenting. They seem like they're totally up for it. But obviously you know, as an informed adult reader, that they are unable to consent in any way, and what she is doing is rape. I don't really know what more to say about this book other than that. I think you'll know immediately if this is something you would be interested in reading. It's a really brilliantly written book, and the character study is fascinating, but obviously it's just a subject matter that I think a lot of people would like to avoid reading about. I'm really glad I read it, but it made me uncomfortable. Another novel that I read this book that does engage with sex but in a very different way was Fishent by Kirsten, and this is probably one of my favourite books of the year. So this book follows a woman named Fiona whose sister Rona went missing 6 years ago. Fiona comes to learn that when Rona went missing she was working as a sex worker, and that leads her to explore different avenues that they hadn't considered looking into when her sister initially disappeared. At the same time, a local sanctuary for sex workers is going to be shut down, and there are a number of protests and a lot of backlash from those working in the sex industry. And essentially this book is both a mystery and an exploration of sex work. It's an exploration of why people get involved in sex work. It explores prejudice towards sex work. It explores how a number of people acting under the term feminism are actually incredibly disrespectful towards sex workers and don't actually listen to sex workers. Fiona forms a number of friendships with these sex workers that she encounters, and throughout this book we kind of see her attitude towards the whole thing really change. What I really appreciated about this book's presentation of sex work was that it showed a real range in the kinds of work that sex workers do. So we saw women that were everything from street workers up to incredibly like high price, high valued sex workers that were only booked by very wealthy, well-known politicians. It looked at like sub-dom culture, but it also looked at the girlfriend experience, and I thought that range was really well done. I was really impressed by the amount of research that the author had put into this book. And this book is also set in Scotland and it uses Scottish dialect, and I was really appreciative of that. I love a book that does dialect well. So yeah, I definitely enjoyed this one. The next book I read was one that I'm sure you've heard about already, and that was 3 Things About Elsie by Joanna Calman. Now, I didn't adore this book as much as a lot of people have. I thought it was really good, but I feel like it's one of those books that left me slightly disappointed because of the amount of hype there was. The protagonist of this novel is a woman named Florence, and the book opens with her lying on the floor of her accommodation. She lives in kind of like an old folks home, and we see her beginning to wonder who's gonna find her and what they'll do when they find her, but we also see her recounting the recent past and what happened when a new resident comes to the care home that she recognizes from her past. And there is a whole mystery there that I did find really, really interesting, discovering the role that this man played in Florence's past. I don't want to reveal too much about it. This book also deals with Florence's relationship with her best friend Elsie. Essentially, a lot of this book deals with things not being exactly as they seem. Also about how the tiniest action can have ripple effects throughout so many people's lives. I think if you enjoyed Joanna Calman's previous novel, The Trouble with Goats and Sheep, then you would really enjoy this one. It has that same thing of unlikely people solving a mystery. And similarly, if you enjoyed Elizabeth is Missing by Emma Healy, I think you would enjoy this one. And there is also, it's also dealing with the topic of memory loss and how we treat older generations. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a fantastic character study. It surprised me in a number of different ways, but it just didn't blow me away in the way that I expected it to. I would still highly recommend it though. However, the Battenberg on the cover is slightly misleading. I don't understand why it's there. Like, it's beautiful, but the Battenberg plays a really small role in this book. The next book I'm going to talk about was one that I was slightly intimidated by and unsure if I was going to get through, but I'm really glad I did, and that is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, and this is the first book in A Song of Ice and Fire. I feel like I don't need to explain what this one is about. We all know what A Game of Thrones is. I was really surprised with how much I enjoyed this one. Now, I listened to it on audiobook and I thought that was a really fantastic way of doing it. The narrator was excellent, although there were some questionable accent choices in it. Some of the voices that he gave characters I don't think quite matched up with my perception of the characters, but obviously that is very highly influenced by the TV show. But it was also things like members of the same family that grew up in the same place had completely different accents. However, I still think the narrator did a fantastic job and I found it very entertaining. But in saying that, I'm not sure how much I would have enjoyed it if I didn't have a high level of familiarity with it because of the TV show. Obviously, there are so many characters in A Game of Thrones and I don't know how well I would have kept up with them and their relationships with one another and the family relationships if I wasn't already familiar with them. I don't read a lot of fantasy that has these wide, expansive worlds and societies, so I think I probably would have struggled with it quite a lot if it wasn't for the TV show. But I did still really enjoy it and I'm definitely going to go on and read the later books in the series. The next book I read was a sci-fi novel and that was Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I think this is the first book in either a series or a trilogy. I have so many mixed thoughts on this book. So this is like a dystopian sci-fi book where humans have moved off planet Earth and we've begun to colonize other planets. Humans have been split into different like social rankings. So we have at the very top of society we have the golds and at the very bottom of society we have the reds. Our protagonist is part of the red group and he is involved in mining. It's very heavy labor, but as the title suggests, there is a rebellion brewing, a uprising of the lower class. And our protagonist is enlisted to infiltrate the gold society, so the very highest upper class society. I thought the world building in this book was fantastic. I thought it was written really well. And I think if you do like sci-fi, then you would really enjoy this one. But there were a couple of reasons why this book and I really got off on the wrong foot. So there is a lot of like sci-fi terminology in there, you know, the different technology that they have. It's not particularly difficult to work out what the things are and what they do, but immediately when there's jargon in a sci-fi book, I start to switch off. But the second thing that really got me off on the wrong foot with this book is to do with the red societal group. So all the different colours are based off a physical attribute that people have. So everyone in the green group of society has green eyes. Everyone in the gold group of society has like golden hair. All things like that. And in the red category of society, everyone has red hair. And everyone in the red society is definitely coded as being Irish. And Pierce Brown has spoken about in the past how he was inspired by the Irish immigration to America, and that immediately made me cautious. When I noticed how coded the Reds were as Irish, I immediately put this wall up. I was immediately on edge. With characters being coded, they are stereotyped, and Irish stereotyping can be incredibly negative, and a lot of those negative stereotypes are repeated in this book. I think there's a fine line between engaging with the drinking culture that there is in Ireland in a respectful and critical way and just stereotyping, negative stereotyping. And I'm not sure where this book fell. It's about the working class rising up and taking rights, and it's about the difficulties that the working class face. But on the other hand, it is just reinforcing those stereotypes as well. I do know a number of Irish people who have really enjoyed this book and found the presentation of the Reds as Irish as something that's really interesting and something really appealing to them. I have a very low tolerance for Irish stereotyping. I don't really think this was the book for me because of those reasons, but I do think if you enjoy sci-fi, you will probably really love this book. The next book I read was The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, and this book is breathtaking. So this book is about a slave named Cora who is working on a plantation in Georgia. Not only is she a slave, but she's also an outcast among the other slaves on the plantation because her mother escaped, leaving Cora behind. Her mother is one of the only slaves to have ever done this, the only one to ever escape from this particular plantation. Nobody really knows what's happened to her, but it's just assumed that she has forged a new life up north or possibly in Canada. And Cora is pretty bitter that her mother has left her behind on this plantation. One day she is approached by a new slave named Caesar, and he tells her about something called the Underground Railroad and asks her if she would come along with him and they can escape the plantation together. What is really inventive and clever and creative about this book is the fact that the Underground Railroad is literal. It is an actual train with conductors. The stops are people's houses, and essentially we follow Cora as she goes through her escape. The abrupt and unexpected violence and death in this book, the idea of being on the run, the constant fear of being caught by these slave hunters is something that I feel reminds me a lot of like dystopian novels. And that completely made me take a step back and think about how the things that happen in this book feel like they are in this far off dystopian society, but these are things that actually happened to people of colour in America. They are things that actually happened to people that were forced to work on these plantations. And the things that happen in this book are shocking and horrible, and it is so important that we do not forget that they happened. I think if you are a fan of Toni Morrison, then you would really like this book, not only because it engages with similar subject matters, but I think stylistically they are somewhat similar in the engagement with magical realism. But yeah, I thought this book was really fantastic, but I don't think I am the voice that you should be listening to with a review of this book, so I will leave a couple of other reviews linked down below that I would highly recommend that you check out. I'm really glad that I got around to this one this month. Next book I'm going to talk about is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, I wasn't really sure what to expect from this novel going into it, but I actually really enjoyed it. The only thing that I really knew about it was this symbol of the Scarlet Letter, and I mostly knew about that from the film Easy A. I knew it was this symbol of adultery, but I didn't really know much about the actual plot of the novel. This was written in 1850, but the events of it actually take place just over 100 years previously, so it is an historical novel. We follow a woman named Hester who has just been released from prison with her newborn daughter Pearl. Hester has been in jail for adultery and she's forced to wear this scarlet letter on her chest. Essentially, we follow her just bringing her daughter up and dealing with people's perception of her because of this symbol that she has to wear all the time. But this book is also about the concealed identities of two men in her life. We have Dimmesdale and Chillingworth, and their identities come to light as the novel progresses. It's an exploration of morality, repentance, sin, the relationship with God, the unfair expectations that are put on women and femininity. Pearl, the daughter, is fantastic. I loved Pearl. I thought she was great. What I found very strange about this novel, however, is the extended introduction. So before we really get into the actual story, we are told this introduction that is really, really long, like especially compared to the chapter lengths in the remainder of the story. But we follow the author of this book, but it's not Nathaniel Hawthorne. At least I don't think so anyway. It's not Nathaniel Hawthorne, it's like this fictitious author of the novel that you are about to read. And he explains why he wrote the novel, what inspired him finding this box of documents and the actual scarlet letter that Hester wore on her clothes, and how that inspired him to retell her story. I'm not sure what that really added to the novel. I'm not sure why it was there. I mean, it does raise some interesting questions about narrative voice, how stories can become altered through different perspectives, because obviously we're reading the story of Hester, but that is filtered through the documents, which are filtered through the fictitious author, which are filtered through the actual author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's a really complicated thing to get your head around, and I'm not sure what I think about the introduction. I'm not sure what the point of it was. If you have any thoughts on this, if you've read the Scarlet Letter, let me know what you thought of the introduction down below, because I'm still a little bit baffled by it. But I am really glad that I read this book. I've not really read a whole lot about that time period either, so it was definitely a valuable reading experience for me, but not really one of my favourite classics. A couple of works of non-fiction now. We have Cheer Up Love, Adventures in Depression with the Crab of Hate by Susan Calman. Now, Susan Calman is a Scottish comedian. I've been a fan of her work for a really long time. I've wanted to get this book for a really long time, but I became an even bigger fan of her when she was on the most recent season of Strictly Come Dancing. I thought she was phenomenal. She was paired with Kevin Clifton, who's my favourite professional dancer on Strictly. This is essentially Susan talking about her experiences with depression and anxiety, and I adored this book. Susan speaks very honestly and openly. She's always emphasising that these are her experiences, and the way that she has dealt with her depression and anxiety isn't necessarily the way that everyone should deal with them. She acknowledges that people have very different experiences with depression and anxiety, but I actually found the way that she has dealt with a lot of stuff is very similar to the way I've dealt with stuff in the past, and it was really refreshing to see someone talk about how I feel. I mean, it's not exactly how I feel, but it can be really positive to see someone dealing with things in the same way that you are. Like, it can be very validating. And this book really made me feel validated. And this isn't a celebrity memoir either. Obviously, we learn a lot about Susan's upbringing and her life and her career as a comedian. Something that I didn't know was that she was actually like a lawyer before she went into comedy, and I found that really interesting. It also talks about her experiences of being a lesbian and her relationship with her wife. But this isn't a celebrity memoir. It is very much a book about depression. And I think sometimes when celebrity memoirs are just like, here are the events of my life, they can be a bit boring. But this definitely wasn't boring. I actually read this in one sitting. I thought it was fantastic. Obviously, this is written before Susan was on Strictly. And I think that makes some elements of this book really interesting. Just to see how her life has changed from the point of her writing this book until now. And she actually has another book coming out later this year, which I think is called Dancing for Joy, and I'm really looking forward to picking that one up as well. Susan really maintained a sense of humour throughout this book, and if you are familiar with her sort of like comedic voice, that really shines through in this book, while it's still being about a very serious subject matter. I was really impressed with how this book was written. I thought it was fantastic and I would highly recommend it. So this month I also read quite a long poetry collection, and that was A Mind Platter by Najwa Zebian. I didn't like this book. I didn't think it was very good at all. I don't really know what to say about it. Like, essentially this poetry collection is just motivational, inspirational, pseudo-intellectual thoughts. I hate saying things like this, particularly in relation to work that is by young women, but it didn't have a lot of literary merit in my opinion. I can understand why a lot of people would like it. If you're someone who's really into like inspirational, motivational quotes, I can understand the value in those. I understand that sometimes you need to read things like that to get yourself into a better headspace, and it's good to know you're not alone. But yeah, this one just wasn't really for me. I also read a single short story. It was probably only about 20 pages long, and that is The Arrangements by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is a story that Chimamanda wrote when she was asked to write about anything to do with the most recent election season in America. So the election season where Donald Trump came to office, and essentially what she has done is it's a short story from Melania's perspective, his wife, and it's kind of like Mrs. Dalloway, like she's planning this party, but it's Melania Trump, not Clarissa Dalloway. I don't really know what to say about this story other than that I thought it was really interesting. It was really, I want to say fun, but obviously there is a very sinister kind of undertone that comes with anything to do with Donald Trump being in office. I thought it was really excellently written, as you would expect from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and I would really recommend this one. It was a very quick read and certainly an entertaining one. I have a few graphic novels and picture books to talk about as well quite quickly. One of those was Ada Lovelace by Isabel Sanchez Vegara, and this is part of the Little People Big Dreams collection of books. I'd previously read the Emmeline Pankhurst one, and I enjoyed this one a lot more. I guess maybe because I didn't know as much about Ada Lovelace. She was one of those women whose name I knew, but I didn't fully understand what she had done. But essentially Ada Lovelace was a mathematician who worked alongside Charles Babbage, and essentially she's responsible for why we have computers. This children's book looks at her as a young child and then follows her into adulthood and looks at what she'd done. Yeah, I would just highly recommend this one. Also, was I the only one that had no idea Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter? Am I the only one that didn't know this? Another picture book I read is one that is more for grown-ups, and that was Little Moments of Love by Catana Chetwynd. You may have seen these cartoons like floating around the internet or floating around like Instagram. But essentially it's what it says in the tin. These illustrations are little moments of love. They are little moments between the illustrator slash author and her partner. One of those really like hashtag relatable things, and as I was looking through this and reading it, I found myself pointing out a lot of them to my boyfriend and being like, that's so you, or like, oh, that's so me. They're a lot of fun. They are really witty and humorous. The illustration style is really cool and quirky. And yeah, this is another one that I would definitely recommend. And the final book I'm going to talk about is a graphic novel. It is called Limited Edition, and it is by Aude Picault. This is about a 30-something woman who is a neonatal nurse. It follows her through a few years of her life and looks at the different relationships that she enters into. It looks at societal pressures and gender norms. I think it's a really fantastic depiction of womanhood. It has this gorgeous yellow colour palette that I thought was absolutely stunning. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. The protagonist is a brilliant female character, and as I said, it's just this brilliant exploration of womanhood and societal pressures of femininity. I don't know how long this video is now. I did toy with the idea last month that I would do 2 wrap-ups this month, like a mid-month and an end of month, but it just didn't happen. I don't feel like it's something that I want to do. Like, I contemplated it a lot, but I just like having all of the books that I read in a month in one video, in one place, and I like having this overall sense of how my reading month went. So yeah, they are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. Let me know down below if you've read any of them and what your thoughts were. We can have a little chat down in the comments. I hope you guys are having a wonderful week, and I will talk to you in my next video.